Right now on Law&Crime Report. One of the officers involved in the death of Breonna Taylor defends his actions in a letter sent to his colleagues. The city is still on edge, waiting for the grand jury decision. Plus, the governor of Florida is proposing a law which would make throwing objects at police officers a minimum 6-month jail sentence. The law is the governor's crackdown on what he considers violent protests.
But what you have to have is clear and predictable penalties.
And later, Vanessa Bryant sues the LA County Sheriff's Department for snapping photos of her husband and child after their fatal helicopter crash. This is the Law&Crime Report, diving into true crime and all legal stories making headlines. It's September 23rd, 2020. Good afternoon and welcome to the Law&Crime Report. We begin our report with Breonna Taylor. For those of you who are following the case, many of us are believing that sometime this week we will get a decision on the grand jury as to whether or not the 3 officers charged in the killing of Breonna Taylor will be indicted on any charges, if at all. Again, the grand jury does not find them guilty by any regards, but it does say whether or not criminal charges will proceed. Of course, Louisville, as we know, is under a state of emergency. However, we want to talk about something that came up at 2 a.m. on Tuesday when one of the former officers, that being Sergeant Mattingly, took to his personal email to speak to some of his officers in his own precinct. He spoke about the maltreatment of officers in his opinion, and by his words, how criminals are canonized and he and other officers are being mistreated. Let's begin by bringing in our guests. We've got a star-studded lineup. We've got Tiffany Simmons, Katie Smith, as well as Lisa Lockwood. Good morning to you all, or I guess good morning to Lisa and good afternoon to Tiffany and Katie based on your time zones.
Good afternoon.
Tiffany, let's start with you. As we're reading some of this email, and I always tell people, maybe sending emails at 2 a.m. is not the best thing to do. You might want to sleep on it literally. What was some of your takeaways when you looked at this email and some of his words?
Well, looking at the email and hearing about it, what I took away from it was desperation. How dare you write this email in desperation when, again, but for your actions or your contribution to this scenario, Breonna Taylor is no longer here. So for me, it just looked very selfish to try to generalize this as something to help criminals, or, you know, just the word choice that he used showed us that it was a desperate attempt just to cover his butt. And that's not really good. We need to hold people accountable, even if they feel it was an accident.
Yeah. Now, Lisa Lockwood, I know that in certain situations, and I agree, officers in some regards, in some cases, are treated very poorly based on them doing their job. I'm not quite sure if this is the situation. I think that's where people are giving the backlash. I want to read a quote from his letter. Regardless of the outcome on today or Wednesday, I know what we did was legal, moral, and ethical thing that night. It's sad how the good guys are being demonized and the criminals are canonized. I understand in the broad sense, but we're talking about Breonna Taylor. She wasn't a criminal, so I'm kind of lost as to his words. What were some of your thoughts as to your reaction when you read this or heard about it?
Well, Sergeant Mattingly, as far as his role in the actual search warrant, prepping for the search warrant, getting the authority for the search warrant, it was a legal search warrant. From his perspective, they followed everything by the book. On top of a no-knock entry, they actually did knock, and they actually did announce police. So there was an announcement, and it was heard by people who were outside and neighbors. The issue that's really challenging right now is the firing of Officer Hankinson, the one who deserved to be fired, in my opinion, as a police officer for his wanton and blindly firing 10 rounds into a house, not knowing the backdrop, not even knowing if there are officers still inside. So he was fired, and I believe the case against him possibly will go forward. As far as the other officers and their involvement, after there was an exchange of bullets, that may be yay or nay. I don't know what's going to happen with that.
Agreed. And I can see that. Katie, I can see a parsing of this because for me at least, Officer Mattingly got put into a dangerous situation based on information that we're still trying to figure out whether or not this warrant was properly filed, what information they had, and he was shot and returned fire. I understand why there might not be criminal charges against him specifically, but some of the language in his letter doesn't really apply here. An innocent person was killed. There were no criminals in that apartment. And as Lisa's pointing out, there may be other people who have more criminal liability. What was some of your thoughts when you heard about this letter?
You know, I agree, Brian. I think that this letter is not so much speaking to this specific incident with Breonna Taylor, but it's speaking to the national tenor involving police misconduct and accountability. And I think that it's really speaking to that larger piece of the puzzle. It's not exactly applicable to what happened here. To again link Breonna Taylor with criminality is factually incorrect, and it stokes the fires of everybody else involved. So I don't think that the email is going to help their cause at all.
Yeah. And it comes off of the back of the city of Louisville giving a record high amount in settling the civil case where they gave $12 million, $3.5 million than they've ever given to anyone in a similar situation in that city, and a lot higher than in many cities. It's very interesting to see how he's categorizing this interaction. Again, I think he's probably talking to the larger discussion, and I don't know if that applies here, but let's listen to Benjamin Crump talk about that record-setting settlement.
From all of these individuals and so many others, especially the activists who came and was on the ground here in Louisville saying that we won't let Breonna Taylor life be swept under the rug. And thank God, with what has happened today, Mayor Fisher, not just with the historic amount, but equally important with the reform that Attorney Bacon, Attorney O'Connor spoke of, it sets a precedence for other Black women, that their lives won't be marginalized, that they will be valued. Lives like Sandra Bland, lives like Pamela Turner in Baytown, Texas, lives like 7-year-old Ayanna Stanley in Detroit, who also was killed as a result of a dangerous no-knock warrant. Because we have to speak truth to power when we get an opportunity. And these dangerous no-knock warrants are disproportionately executed against Black people in America. And so I'm very happy that the Metro Council also stood united with Tamika Palmer to pass Breonna's law to abolish these dangerous no-knock warrants, because it was foreseeable who was most being put in danger with these no-knock warrants.
All right, so I think everyone here, like everyone in the country, is waiting on pins and needles because we're expecting a decision by the grand jury to come up soon, whether it be this week, whether it be today, whether it be tomorrow. We don't know, but soon is what we're all being told, especially based on the preparations that the city is taking. Tiffany, let's ask you the question of, if there is an indictment, what would we expect going forward if there is an indictment in this case?
If there is an indictment in this case, what I would expect to see probably is a full trial. I don't expect to see a plea deal because, as we see, they're not already taking accountability of their actions. I agree with what Lisa stated earlier in reference to the officer that was fired. Rightfully so, he did his actions of shooting 10 rounds into this house, shots which killed Breonna Taylor. He should be held accountable. As far as the actions of the other officers, that is yet to be seen. That may be seen in the trial. But this should also show people in this community the importance of voting. I hope that everyone is registered to vote, because your district attorneys, the elected officials, those people matter. So make sure you vote, because that affects cases such as this.
Yeah. So Katie, I'll come to you and ask the inverse. What if we do not seeing indictment here. There is no true bill. What next?
I think we're going to see a lot of backlash from the community, especially when there appears to be something that's on its face inconsistent, right? There's this soft admission of civil liability. And what I mean by that is usually when a case is settled, they don't admit they did something wrong, but it speaks volumes by how much money was paid, right? So we have that on one side. And then if we don't have criminal liability on the other, to the community, that often feels incongruent, even though we in the legal community know that those are two totally different standards. But I suspect that we're going to see a lot of protests, a lot of on the ground and grassroots movements pushing back. So hopefully the cops are held accountable appropriately in this case, and I have faith that they will be.
Yeah. And then, Lisa, you've articulated it very well, and I think I haven't seen it in much other places but here at the Law&Crime Trial Network, where we're not taking all the officers in one big bag and saying indict or not. We're looking at the actions of the individual officers, and we're saying, okay, Sergeant Mattingly, I kind of understand that you got shot in the leg and returned fire, so maybe that's not criminal. But the other officers, do you think that there is space in this climate for Louisville to come back and say, no true bill for Sergeant Mattingly, no true bill maybe for another officer, but for Officer Hankinson, true bill? Do you think there's a potential for that?
I do, legally. Having served many search warrants, having gone on no-knock search warrants and knock search warrants, the amount of danger that is involved when entering. Why do we have a no-knock? We don't want to get rid of evidence, and we also want to keep people safe. The element of surprise coming into the house. Unfortunately, in this instance, Breonna's boyfriend did have a gun, and he felt he was protecting himself. He didn't hear the officers call out, police, police, etc. He thought that the house was being broken into. So what he did and his actions are congruent to what anybody would do if he did not hear police being called over and over again. So the fact that he did shoot, I believe a common person in any scenario would do exactly as he did if he did not hear the announcement of police. So with the officers, with the initial entry into the house and fire was received upon them, they did the exchange and they retreated. The issue that we have that I think is in clear breach and violation of any policy is the willful and wanton shooting within that house, not knowing the backdrop.
All right, so we'll see how that plays out. Again, we are all on pins and needles on the edge of our seat, waiting for a decision out of Louisville sometime this week. But we're going to take a quick break and come back with more here at the Law&Crime Report.
But what you have to have is clear and predictable penalties. I look at what goes on in Portland, and they'll have people, they'll arrest them. These are all scraggly looking, Antifa types. They get their mugshot taken, and then they get released. And it's like a carousel. On and on it goes. That's not going to happen here in Florida. If you are involved in a violent or disorderly assembly and you harm somebody, if you throw a brick and hit a police officer, you're going to jail. And there's going to be a mandatory minimum jail sentence of at least 6 months for anyone who strikes a police officer, either with a weapon or a projectile. And we're also not going to simply let people back out onto the street. So if you are in custody for one of these offenses relating to a violent or disorderly assembly, you're not getting bail before your first appearance. And then there's a rebuttable presumption against bail after that. We also have offense enhancements. And so if you do throw an object during a violent or disorderly assembly, that will be an enhanced penalty, as well as assault or battery of a law enforcement officer during one of these violent or disorderly assemblies. And if you are from another state and you come to participate in one of these violent or disorderly assemblies, you're going to have extra penalties imposed on you as well.
Right, so that is the governor of Florida really outlining the details of this new law. As you heard him say, throwing objects at a police officer or law enforcement would have a minimum of 6 months in jail. That's raising the mandatory minimum for those types of charges. Also imposing felony penalties for protesters who would block roadways or topple monuments or even harass people. He basically said in another part, there's going to be a ton of bricks raining down on those who commit such acts. As we listen to some of these laws, of course, these are not laws in the books as yet. These are not the clearly defined legal terms or elements of the crimes. But as we hear this starting off, let's start with you, Lisa. What are some of your thoughts as to how these new laws will play out, both for individuals protesting and originate from the state, but we also heard that component of people coming from outside the state and coming in?
Well, watching obviously the climate across the nation for all of the protests, the fires, the violence that is taking place. Yes, there are some peaceful protests who are doing it the right way according to the Constitution. And seeing the destruction, we're talking billions of dollars of destruction. We're talking about businesses where people who are being hurt. The list goes on and on. Deaths across some of the largest cities have just been enormous. So protecting police officers, I think is extremely important, because right now it's almost like a war zone. Police officers are out there, they're retiring early, they're leaving, they're getting out of law enforcement because they don't feel they're being protected. It's a revolving door in a lot of cases where we have these protesters who are able to make bail, get out the door, and go out and re-protest again. And we have seen that over and over again. So I think what Governor DeSantis is trying to do is set a precedent for a deterrent. This will not go into effect until it's passed, until next March. And we know a lot of things are happening right now in our country. And we have an election coming up, and potentially more violence and looting based on what's happening politically. So I think right now he's taking a stance and having a broadcast with that, because he has the audience to do so, to prevent it from happening in Florida.
Now, Katie, as I'm listening to some of the words he's saying, especially about bail, and of course, I don't practice in Florida, but some of the stuff he's saying doesn't sound right, even based on federal laws of bail in terms of a presumption of release. It sounds like he's saying, well, we're just going to remand. Basically, you can't have any form of bail, because if he's saying that bail should be set and it's a revolving door, I mean, if I go protest and have $10,000 in my bank and I pay for it and get out and go protest again, I'm still doing the same thing. So it really sounds that he's mad at people who can't afford bail or can't afford bail. It seems more monetary than the actual action. I'm not sure how it's going to hold up. What are your thoughts?
I agree, Brian. I think a lot of this is probably more politically motivated than it is practical. I mean, there's so much rhetoric in what he had said about not wanting Florida to go down the road of where some of the other places have gone, obviously, in part referring to places like New York that are more democratically run. I think that this is not a coincidence that this is timed this way with the election. So what he is saying now versus what will actually come to pass, I think is going to be very different. So, because remember, at the end of the day, with these types of rules, you can't unlawfully curb a First Amendment speech. So to make it unlawful to be a part of a group where a certain bad actors are acting in a way that's illegal and holding all the other people who are a part of that group but not directly participating liable is deeply problematic constitutionally. So I think that this is just the first iteration of many discussions we're going to have about this.
Yeah, and Tiffany, the same thing, like, I get it, and I kind of agree with Katie, and I also agree with Lisa that this is an action in response to the times. But as I hear him outline it, I'm thinking, I don't know if that's going to pass constitutional muster under the 14th Amendment. I mean, I'm from New York. If I come to Florida, that means that my penalties are going to be higher than someone who lives in Florida doing the same action. How is that equal protection under the law? My First Amendment speech could be chilled because of this. And it just seems so odd that it might not actually legally work. Do you think this is an actual legal step taken, or something that's in preparation of the times to come? Tiffany, I'm sorry. I think you're muted there for a second.
I do think that this is an indicator of times to come. However, I stress the importance of voting. Just as Katie said, this is something that appears to be more political over what is practical. And I also agree with what Lisa said, that this is possibly a deterrent to violence. However, it also discourages peaceful protests. So this is something that I think it is a slippery slope, because in his statement, he talked about clear, predictable penalties. But he proposed a law that is so subjective. How can we determine what is what? How can we determine what is peaceful protest? How can we determine, the practicalities? And of course, me being a criminal defense attorney, I would fight for my clients, as I've done in the past, against this proposed law.
Yeah, it seems like, and Lisa, I'll pitch this to you because it's for many places, I think no one wants to see the property damage. No one wants to see people being kept in jail for long periods of times on low-level crime. So everyone, I think, at this point is scattering to figure out what's the solution. How do we allow people to use their First Amendment rights but not have buildings burned down or destruction of federal property? And so I guess here's the question. If engaging in more, do we believe that engaging in more arrest will help to de-escalate the violence? Because it seems in some places like Portland, it's just it's like the snake is eating itself. The protesters are getting more violent and the officers have to crack down because they're getting more violent, and people are getting more violent because they're cracking down. How do we solve this, I guess, is the million-dollar question everyone's asking.
It is. I think having Governor DeSantis saying that the sanctions are going to be worse in Florida, and he's not going to go the other route of other states who are having the revolving door system, is him trying to take a preventative measure. Is it going to help? I mean, that's the bottom line. What's going to prevent this? We want people to go out and protest. It's extremely important. We need to do that. It's part of the Constitution. You don't feel something is right, you go and you make a stand, and people are able to hear your voice. The issue is all of the damage, all of the looting that has taken place, all of the injuries to police officers included, who are going out not knowing if they're going to return to their families. And then on top of that, we have officers who are ambushed and executed based on the climate of what is happening right now with police and defunding police, et cetera. So the goal of police is to keep people safe. That's the global mission, is to keep people safe. And in order to do that, they need to be safe themselves. So having looters, having protesters who are violent, who are throwing things and destroying property, they're put in another classification. And I think that's what he's trying to say. I don't think that there's going to be a big lump of, this insurgence of vans showing up and just loading up a bunch of people into a van and taking them to jail because they're just protesting peacefully. It's a matter of finding who are actually doing the violations, and it's easy to see their body cams now. There are other people who are recording it. It's easy to see what's happening and who's doing what.
Yeah. And then Katie, so Lisa brings up strong points. Yes, we're seeing officers being executed in their cars. I mean, we've seen it both recently, but also in the past. I know there was being in Brooklyn, the one that always comes to mind is the one that happened in 2014 when an individual, I think, came from a different state and did a similar action in Brooklyn a few years back, looting, property damage. But when I hear some of these stories about what they're doing, and I think Portland is an animal in of itself. If this happens in New York, you throw something at an officer, that's assault of an officer. You get bail for that. If you go into a commercial property and you commit arson, that's arson. There's bail for that. For a lot of the things that people are most fearful of, it already appears that those laws are in place that bail should be given. But now it seems like you're asking for that to be extended to the lower end. So that's the part that I'm always confused on. If you throw something at an officer, you go to jail. I've never seen it otherwise. So I'm confused as to what he's asking for.
I agree, Brian, and that's why the thing goes off my brain where I say, well, this is more political than practical, because the things that are illegal are already illegal. They just need to be enforced. And to Lisa's point, if all these technologies are out there where we can identify the wrongdoer, then that stuff's already out there. We should be doing that. I think the problem with this is you're painting a broad brush where you can attack people who are not knowingly involved in these legal protests and try to get them lumped in. That's my major concern. But assaulting a police officer, throwing stuff at them, all these other property damage, they are already unlawful, and there's stuff on the books to deal with that as it is. So I'm not sure what this adds other than to stoke fear and in an effort to be more of a preventative measure. That's what I see.
Yeah, because Tiffany, my thoughts were that, as Lisa was pointing out, in some of these areas, it's like a war zone. It's the chaos of the environment that does not allow officers to apprehend these people. that you can have someone walk up to an officer's car, discharge a gun, and kill them. And I don't think you're going to find a single soul on this broadcast right now, or probably in this country, that's going to say that person shouldn't be locked up. I think we're all going to agree with that. But because of the chaos of it all, we can't find that person. So should we be looking more to, all right, how do we get those bad apples? How do we find them? How do we get them processed properly? More than just saying, all right, we're going to make more laws now. Because really, we're trying to find these people, not trying to incarcerate more people who might do innocent behavior.
Right. I totally agree with what Katie has said. This law really is more so to invoke fear instead of enforcing what we already have. I also agree with you on the fact that we need to focus on ways to catch the actual criminals of wrongdoing, or the criminals that are committing the felonies, versus having a blanket type law proposed that may affect the least of us. When I represented protesters in the past, they weren't the people that could honestly bail themselves out the next day. We were doing grassroots efforts to help protesters. So I agree with Katie that this is something that is more political than practical. We can already use the laws that are in place versus creating something that may oppress more people that are using their rights properly, versus attacking or finding the so-called bad apples.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure I'm very clear on this. I agree with the governor in the sense of those people committing those acts need to be arrested and go through the system and have due process. But I'm not sure if creating more laws helps with the enforcement or finding of those individuals. I think creating the more laws could actually trap more innocent people. And I just think we should be attacking this with a scalpel rather than a hammer. That's my only part here. I don't think they should all be like running around chaotically in the streets. I think there should be some sort of due process there. But let's take a quick break and come back with more here at the Law and Crime Report. Welcome back for our next story. This is a tragic story where we're continuing the death of Kobe Bryant, where we're finding out that Vanessa Bryant, his wife, is filing a civil suit against the LA County Sheriff's Department because, according to the report, at least 8 officers shared photographs, very intimate and private photographs of the helicopter crash that killed, I believe, about 8 individuals, including Kobe Bryant, as well as his daughter. And they shared it in a way that I think is so common to many of us. From my understanding, it is a group of men who are sharing these photos at a bar to try to, I guess, impress other people or women they were talking about in the bar. But this was a very intimate and very private matter that was shared, and Vanessa Bryant is not having it. Let's bring in our guests. Let's start with you, Lisa. Talk to us about this case, not only about this invasion of privacy, but also about the conduct of the officers and how this might need to be handled going forward.
Yeah, so there is standard operating procedures when getting to a crash site, getting to a crime scene. There are individuals, crime scene techs, it's their job to take the photographs and then secure those into evidence. The only reason a police officer would use their personal phone on a crime scene is if the crime scene was going to be, if wind was going to take something away, if something was going to be moved. They want to make sure they secure the scene, no other people can get involved, and then go ahead and maybe use those pictures in the event the crime scene was going to be disrupted in any way. To actually take out your camera and take personal photos of a crime scene in a place where it didn't warrant that is conduct unbecoming. And I believe Vanessa has every right to do what she's doing, because once it was leaked and it was found out and reported, she contacted LAPD and basically said, why is this happening? What kind of discipline is being done? And the response that she got was, they were told to delete the photos. I mean, it was so dismissive and so disrespectful to this woman who lost her husband and her child. The amount of mental anguish knowing that these exist and they're out there in the public is so grotesque and disheartening.
Now, Lisa, just like a follow-up question, because you kind of said a buzzword there that I want to follow up on, conduct unbecoming and the response of the department. Is conduct unbecoming of an officer or grounds to terminate them? Do you think that there should be more than just, hey guys, delete the photos and move on? Do you think this should be handled differently?
Absolutely, because conduct unbecoming, anything that's going to show any type of disrespect to the department, to the police officers, falls under that guideline. So there could be many things that fit under that criteria, how far it's going to go. So, and then based on the police officer's priors. So you find out that the police officer have prior incidents involving the same thing or other things where their conduct was just a terrible precedent to have somebody in that job morally and upholding their badge and the oath that they took to protect. So if the public was there and they took pictures and they had it on their cell phone, they have every right to. It's in a public place. They could have sold those images. The police officers could have sold those images, and this could have gotten a lot worse. So is it cause for firing? Probably not. And it would be based on priors with the police officers.
Understood. Now, Tiffany, in this civil suit, Vanessa Bryant is saying the biggest threat to the sanctity of the victim's remains proved to be that of the sheriff's department itself. Faced with a scene of unimaginable loss, no fewer than 8 sheriff's deputies at the crash site pulled out their personal phones and snapped photos. This seems to be a very tragic and hurtful act by the officers to the Bryant family, and that's how it's being taken. What were some of your thoughts hearing these words, Tiffany?
Well, it was very tragic. I believe these officers should be held accountable. They should be held to a higher standard, especially wearing the title of police officer. Kobe Bryant was a man that gave to the LA community. So it definitely was willful disregard for his life, his daughter's life, disregard for his family and the privacy. I mean, to file a 21-page complaint, and, you know, just to go with what Lisa said, that she was dismissed when she contacted the LAPD to let them know, you know, her views and her feelings. To see the remains of your child and your husband, like she said, she was physically ill. And the more we allow officers' behaviors to be swept under the rug, the more they will continue to do certain things. So these officers definitely need to be held accountable. I don't know if it's to the level of firing. However, as we see in this world, we have plenty officers where their behavior was swept under the rug and they continue to do things because they felt like they were untouchable. So they definitely need to address this. And I'm proud of her for moving forward with a lawsuit because it's very draining emotionally. And I'm sure she's still trying to grieve and heal through the loss of her daughter and her husband.
All right, so Katie, I've got the ethical standpoint from Lisa. She's kind of telling me the procedures of how officers operate. Tiffany's giving me kind of the moral aspect of this as well. I got to come to you for the legal then. Is this, and I'm playing a little devil's advocate because I think there might be some legal repercussions here, but is this something that we are merely ethically and morally outraged, but Vanessa Bryant may not have the legal recourse that we might want her to have?
Yes, and thanks for coming to me with the hard one, Brian. Yeah, I think that if this came to me, it's not a case that I would take a civil case because I don't think, even if there is a constitutional right or right to privacy that can be asserted by the estate of the decedent or the surviving member, so there's that. You also have to get to damages. And there absolutely can be some quantifiable emotional damages. I doubt pecuniary damages as a result of disseminating or sharing this information. But these are people who initially were permitted to have these photographs. Contrary to Lisa's experience, I've seen in a lot of instances NYPD use their own phones for personal phones for department business. So it's not beyond the pale, I think, that they would have gotten these photographs. So it's really, well, what are those damages? Really, what is that worth? And it's terrible to have to quantify something to deal with this, but that's what law does, right? That's what civil law does, is you're forced to quantify terrible things. And I think that when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, it might not be a successful case. But I have a sneaking suspicion that that's not what they're in for anyway. I don't think that they're trying to get rich on this civil case. I think they're just trying to come after the department in any way they really can to get these cops held accountable. So yes, I think that this is much more of a disciplinary issue than it is a valid civil suit.
Yeah. So, Lisa Lockwood, at the very least, I'm thinking there's going to be a very serious discussion in the department about how to move forward on this. Can you kind of help us be a little fly on the wall as to what you would expect the conversation in the sheriff's department would be after hearing about such a lawsuit to those sheriffs and maybe other sheriffs as to how to operate going forward?
I think something similar to what Governor DeSantis is doing, where he's getting at the pulpit and saying these are the type of sanctions that you are going to see going forward if this happens. So departments across the nation are going to look at this now. When we get these photographs, what do we do with these photographs that we've taken from a crime scene to aid the person who is investigating this? And then how do we dispose of these and make sure that they're not out there for public circulation? And this has been happening for a long time, trust me. It's just coming out now, fortunately, because even before I was thinking about being a police officer, I remember being at some kind of a festival, and there was a crime scene technician who had a whole pack of the old-time Polaroid pictures showing grotesque crime scene photos. And it was horrible. Just thought, wow, you know, this is happening. Why do you have these right now in a public setting? And it's about personal significance and showing off, and I did this, et cetera. So it has been happening for a long time, and it makes it much easier now in the digital world. So how do we clean this up? What kind of sanctions are we going to have going forward?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, Katie, all right, I gave you the tough one, Katie. I'll give you the easy one now. I had faith in you. You did amazing, though. If Lisa is saying that she's seen this since she started as an officer, then how do we curtail this? How do we, because I'm sorry, men are going to continually use photos to try to impress women. It's happened at the dawn of time. It's going to probably happen to the end of time. But when you are given the privilege to work in this setting and you're supposed to protect people's privacies, what kind of backlash should these people face when they do these things? Like, how do we prevent this going forward so we're not have to talk about this in the future to come?
Yeah, and you're right, Brian. You know, people are always attracted to the macabre, and there's always going to be that type of interest. It's not going to go away that people are going to want to gather around and look at the car accident, right? And that's like sort of the equivalent of this, especially when it has to deal with someone who's famous. And that's the other level of this. This department should be used to dealing with sensitive issues with fame. So how do we curtail this? I think the major thing is just don't let people have their personal phones on duty. I see that all the time with NYPD. It drives me crazy because there's this beneath the rug communication that officers have with each other. And that shouldn't be happening. They should be on only official channels. So if you just limit that to departmental devices, and the department then has better oversight over their professional devices, then you can lead to less leaking. But I'll tell you what, back in the day of Polaroids, I imagine it was harder to leak things than now with digital. It's so easy to share it. So, you know, you're constantly going to be chasing after the dragon on this. It's really hard to curtail completely.
Yeah, we'll see how this plays out. We're going to take a quick break and come back with more here on the Law and Crime Report. So that was a surveillance video of the two LA officers who were shot at point blank execution style in their vehicles. Now, we've heard reports that they heroically assisted each other, and probably but for that heroicness, they would not have been able to walk out of the hospital as we're reporting today. Both of them are safe. They're heading home, and we wish them all the best in a speedy recovery. And also the hope, as I think LA is continuing to do, to try to find who that person is, because that person does need to be brought to justice, and we're all hoping that can happen. Let's bring in our guests for our final segment and talk about this one. Lisa, I think we're all excited and happy to hear that they're going home now. They're out of the woods. I know it was touch and go at the very beginning because of the nature of these injuries. What are some of your thoughts when you hear the initial story that they're out of the hospital?
Oh, elated. And like you said, the officer who applied a tourniquet and just went into action, that was fantastic. A lot of times, even in wartime situations, when people are shot and they're not grave wounds, sometimes die just from the shock of it. So the fact that they were able to assist each other and think about survival was incredible. The thing that I'm most excited about right now is they keep raising the reward for finding the shooter. So I believe we're at $700,000 right now, and I do believe it's going to happen. We're going to find him sooner than later.
And that's correct, Tiffany. The reward amount is growing and growing. I think in the beginning it was under $100,000 at the very beginning, and then quickly climbed. And as Lisa said, it's now $700,000. That's a lot of money. I would expect that someone who knows anything might come forward. What are some of your thoughts about both the officers coming out of the hospital as well as the $700,000 reward?
Well, although I'm the criminal defense attorney, I am a person that has a strong moral compass. So I agree with Lisa. I am elated that these officers pulled through. I am grateful that they are coming around into good health. The reward, I hope that it does work. I hope that it does help this person who ambushed innocent officers, you know, and try to kill them execution style. That person needs to be held accountable just as bad police officers need to be held accountable. So, you know, I am grateful that they use their skills that they learned as police officers or EMTs or whatever sort of training to help each other in a situation where their life was in danger. And that shows a good sign of good officers, honestly.
Yeah.
So I hope that this person is caught soon.
Yeah, and I like that. I hope these officers actually go out and teach other officers how to react in these situations, because that I think is something that every officer needs to know, and I want to see that going forward. Let's switch gears for the last topic here, and let's go to Oregon, where we're hearing about forest fires and people evacuating their homes to be safe. But people are sliding in and committing crimes in those homes of allegedly burglarizing, stealing, and damaging those homes as people are fleeing for their safety. Katie, what I'm hearing is that almost 21 people were arrested during the level 2 and level 3 wildfire evacuation during the course of about 2 weeks. Those homeowners are fleeing for their life, and of course, not bringing everything with them, but now they're on top of their homes potentially being burned down. There's also this potential of being burglarized. Some of your thoughts and when you first heard this story break.
I think it's messed up. I mean, it's terrible, right? It's the worst possible combination, right? You're taken out of your home based on a natural disaster, and then people, you know, use that situation to their benefit to come in and rob you. Sad part is it's not super uncommon. We've seen that happen in Sandy. Whenever there's a major disruption to the police force and people are scattering, you know, unfortunately, the bad guys use that as an opportunity to rob you. And I'm so glad, though, that the police are tracking these guys down and they're holding them accountable, because that's just a new level of low, right? Like taking advantage of people when they're down.
Yeah, and Lisa, let's kind of talk about that as we have like 90 seconds before the show ends, where people are taking opportunities to come in and harm people in this way. The officers are obviously more concerned about the fires, and the firefighters are there. Right. No one's really watching the homes, because why would you watch the homes? There's a fire coming. But people come in and take advantage. Can you kind of talk about how that is from a police perspective?
This is part of the briefings. When police get ready to hit the street and they're be on the lookout bolos, it is look for these things in addition to trying to save people, trying to evacuate. And now we have the opportunists that are going to come. As Katie said, in national disasters, they do this. This is their prime time when they know that police officers, their job is being used in other areas that are far more important. So one of the things that is happening in addition to this is there are people who are taking the law in their own hands and actually stopping people with their own guns and asserting kind of their own police state, because they know the police officers are busy, and they're trying to discourage them, saying, you know, we don't want you pulling people over. Do not use your guns. Do not detain. Call us. But knowing full well that the police are not able to respond to all of these. So this part was interesting to hear in the news as well.
Yeah. Well, as Oregon is on fire and people are burglarizing their home, we hope that everyone stays safe there, and hoping that the officers and neighbors and community can come together to help protect and rebuild. Tiffany Simmons, Katie Smith, Lisa Lockwood, I want to thank you very much for taking your time to come out here and lend us your expert legal analysis. We're going to continue more here at the Law and Crime Child Network. We've got our regularly scheduled program. Make sure to stay around for that. As I said, the Breonna Taylor grand jury decision should be coming sometime this week. Today, tomorrow, Friday, we don't know, but the only way you're going to find out is by staying here at the Law and Crime Child Network. Have a nice day, and we'll see you later.